Well, just to kick off, I think, kind of everyone in the room knows who you are, which is why they're here. They definitely know what Ethereum is, but I wonder if you could just tell a little bit about your story. Like, how did you come to be so involved in, this like important breakthrough moment?
So personally, technologist, did about 10 years of robotics, machine vision, neural nets, then built an automated music composition tool with some friends, made really good music, made really bad music, got more conventional, so software consultant for quite a while. So basically software engineer in different niches. Spent a little time at Goldman Sachs towards the end of that aspect of my career, and was really just on the IT side of private wealth management. And when I left there, a friend of mine was managing money for a wealthy family with novel strategies and doing very well, and they were trying to cut his percentage down. He's like, no. and so he asked me if I would help him build back office, and we ended up running a hedge fund or a set of hedge funds for a little while, and doing reasonably well. And so I was kind of trading and building trading strategies, and getting increasingly disappointed and disillusioned with the structure of the world and the structure of the economy. And it was a couple of years before the financial crisis, and just a little bit before the financial crisis, basically stopped trading because I was tired of just doing the risk on, risk off trade. That didn't make sense. The fundamentals weren't really working. So kind of checked out, and did stuff, lived in Jamaica for a little while, and was appreciative. I wasn't an occupier, but I was appreciative of the people who were occupying everything, trying to get the word out that that things were awry in economies, and so essentially early 2011, I read the Bitcoin white paper. I read Slashdot pretty religiously and saw some references, but didn't jump into it until then. And when I read it, it was clear to me that we could stop occupying things and just start building alternative or adjacent infrastructure, and grow our way, or build alternative systems with better foundations, and let the legacy world do what it's going to do, which I thought was either going to be a slow cascading collapse over a couple decades, or rapid nonlinear contagion that wouldn't be so good. But so there were two scenarios, or a couple scenarios, that I thought could get us out of that. One was free energy or instantaneous teleportation, like big things. And it turned out that blockchain came along, and it's not as big a thing, but it provided us with a different path forward. So essentially changing the nature of trust on the planet, guaranteeing execution of agreements or laws, regulations, etc. That's a pretty big thing. And so, roughly 3 years later, I'm from Toronto, Vitalik's from Toronto. I pretty much always go back over Christmas to hang with my family, and met up with Vitalik there at a meetup, and read the white paper that night. And similar to my Bitcoin moment, where I thought this would enable us to change everything, I thought that Vitalik's vision was scalable in the sense of human action, where instead of protocol priests building new opcodes in at the protocol layer of these different systems that we were looking at, which was going to be unscalable for all the world's use cases, a clean separation of the protocol layer from the application layer would enable millions of entrepreneurs and software engineers around the world to identify their own problems and build their own solutions. And so I stayed, it was about a month after he'd written the white paper. I stayed close to the project for the next 2 or 3 weeks. We all gathered in a house in Miami for a week in advance of the North American Bitcoin conference, and Vitalik announced the paper, and we basically formed the project there. A year later, we're getting close to releasing version 1 of the platform, and there aren't too many people building at the application layer, so started ConsenSys to basically continue the vision of the Ethereum project.
And can you tell us a bit about ConsenSys? I mean, I know a bit about it because we've been talking to your team here, but like the growth is pretty extraordinary. Can you tell people a little bit about what it is today and what the vision is?
Sure. So we started as a venture production studio. We intended to build some MVPs and wrap little companies around them and put them out for external investment and grow that way. The ecosystem took off fairly quickly, so we've been able to be much more patient. We built things like a dApp store, and the person who was building the dApp store was frustrated because he didn't have developer tools, and so he built Truffle Suite, which some of you may have heard of. It's been downloaded about 1 million times, and it's one of the dominant developer suites in our space. We had a team, another team that was actually external. So back then you had to, if you're going to have your customer use your decentralized application, first you tell them to go to GitHub and download the Ethereum client and wait for 8 hours or 3 days for it to sync, and then you can type your URL into the browser and connect via IPC or RPC. So that wasn't obviously viable. So the MetaMask team, a guy named Aaron Davis, came in-house very early and built that technology, and we had another team in Fura that just started building test nets for our different projects in-house, and at DevCon 1 they decided to share that technology with everybody, and now it handles between 8 and 10 billion queries per day. So it's a pretty amazing team, actually. So venture production studio, we do lots of protocol work, so we built a couple clients already, and we're building, or been instrumental in 2 clients already. We're building another client. And we do lots of protocol-based open platforms, network business models in music and healthcare and supply chain and other niches. And we do lots of consulting work, so for companies, governments, central banks, lots of educational work. ConsenSys Academies educated about 1,500 developers and a bunch of lawyers and continuing legal education programs and many other kinds of learners. And we've got a course on Coursera for non-technical people now, and ebooks. And fourth prong is capital markets. So from foundational stuff like a custody solution, Trustology, a London-based project. Many of you may know Alex Batlin. He was instrumental in Level 39 and UBS. He ran blockchain at UBS early on, and then moved to BNY Mellon. So awesome solution, awesome team. And it's going to be, I think, a catalyst for real adoption at an institutional level. Not necessarily that project, but that project and ones like it. And we do lots of venture investing. And token launching, whether they're our own internal projects or third-party projects.
Got it. One thing I'm very interested in is obviously like core to everything you're talking about is this kind of broad idea of decentralization. Is that also the principle on which, I know that ConsenSys is decentralized as in it's spread around the world. Like, how do you think about running this organization as almost a new kind of organization? Talk a little bit about that.
So it may end up being one of the more important things we do. The thesis early on was that we wouldn't want to or be able to build a Microsoft or an Apple. Information's just too easy to obtain. Barriers to entry to building a significant project are very low. It's inexpensive to create a startup. You know, with blockchain, and this was a really early insight, but with blockchain, you don't really need to be close to capital anymore, right? So you just need to be creative. You need the ideas. You need the execution. So with that in mind, we wanted to create the best place in the world for blockchain-focused, Ethereum-focused entrepreneurs to be, whether they're 0 to 1 people, whether they're serial entrepreneurs. There should be no reason for them to want to leave. And we've developed just a huge amount of depth and breadth. Some of the superstars in the blockchain space are currently at ConsenSys, and it's a good, fun place to work. In terms of governance, try to keep it as flat and fluid as possible. We try to enable all of our teams to have as much autonomy as possible. We're moving more in that direction. Things like our service circles, legal, marketing, HR, finance, we're trying to move those in the direction of being autonomous as well. So they're core functions, but we also want them to essentially produce products and services because we're doing things in a different way, in a new way, and we hope to share that with the world. We have a tool that we're using to glue a lot of it together. It's called TMNT, Traditional Management Nullification Tool. And yes, it has turtles as its icon. We'll have to figure that out over time. The turtles won't stay. And it represents all of our groups as circles, circles within circles. Everybody can sign in with their U-port. Everybody can map the work that they're doing in terms of percentages. We're moving OKRs, KPIs into it. We're moving agreement infrastructures into it. So if two people need to make an agreement, they can memorialize it there. We have a technology called Open Law, which enables legally enforceable blockchain-based agreements. And some of the clauses in an agreement can be programmatic, so it can send data, it can act. We'll attach to these agreements KPIs and maybe not OKRs, but KPIs, and essentially do our best to, and our labs team is sort of tasked with this responsibility along with Open Law and along with this TMNT team to basically take every one of our functional units and wrap them in APIs and attach SLAs to those APIs in the form of these legally enforceable blockchain-based agreements. So we're experimenting all over the place, basically, and trying to keep it flat. We don't want hierarchy, or we don't want rigid hierarchy. We don't want decisions to be made as far from the situated awareness as possible. We don't want people telling people what to do. I guess for everybody, we want people to have voice, people to know that they're being heard, people to have an understanding of how decisions are being made so that it's transparent. Yeah. We don't want everybody involved in every decision, so we're trying to figure out frameworks where decision making is fairly efficient even while everybody feels like they have agency.
So that's one from me before I read some of the Slido ones. Where do you see the world is in its sort of, presumably you kind of see a world where many more organizations are run like this, and you're building the tooling to make that possible. Kind of, where do you think we are in that sort of adoption curve? Do you see a world where all organizations are run like this, or how do you think about that?
It's not really up to me. I think organizations should configure themselves as they want to, as is appropriate for their context. There'll be lots of traditionally architected organizations for a long time. I think governments, just the context that we're embedded in will necessitate that. I think decentralization, I think flatness and fluidity will be very difficult to beat. We're moving into a world of multiple overlapping exponential technologies. It is getting very complex, very crazy. It's hard for us as human beings to deal with that sort of pace and complexity. And if you're not building a very agile organization, you're probably not going to last very long. Except in some niches, maybe, I don't know.
Well, that's a good lead into the most upvoted question so far, which is kind of, what do you think Ethereum's long-term prospects? Do you think it will survive for the long run, kind of in its current form?
I think that blockchain technology is going to evolve pretty dramatically over various different phases. We're in phase 1 right now, where these toy systems process every transaction, and they're optimizations of this, but they store all the data. So that's great for doing a few things, but it's obviously not going to serve society broadly. And we're moving towards figuring out how we can get enough security on these platforms while also achieving scalability. So we get security from decentralization or radical decentralization, and we get scaling from layer 2 solutions, and there are a bunch of those that have come online already. So Funfair, Spank Chain, Raiden, Micro Raiden, using the state channel technology, and a bunch of sidechain projects are coming online. It's a lot of games are bringing their own layer 2 technology, and the plasma technology for linking sidechains into the base layer, the trust layer of Ethereum. There are about 7 or 8 different ways of using it for different purposes, and it basically confers the trust at the first layer to a more scalable blockchain system at the second layer, so that you can be certain that if these people are malicious, if they run away for some reason, or if you just want to pull your digital sword out of this game and move it to this exchange or to that game, you can do that, and you can be certain that it's checkpointed on layer 1 Ethereum, and you're in no danger of losing your assets. So that's phase 2. Phase 3 is sharding and proof of stake, and it's already getting built out. So it's hard to kill a blockchain. It's hard to kill these tokens. So certainly Ethereum will continue to be significant at minimum. It will very likely keep up with, at the base layer, with scalability that other platforms introduce. And it's orders of magnitude larger than anything else right now and growing exponentially. So it's going to be hard to kill. It may, I think something called Ethereum will exist in 10 years from now. It'll be a very different architecture. But there's a lot of people that believe in the technology, that like working together. It's a very collaborative ecosystem, and we'll probably continue to build out something called Ethereum. Even if all of us leave, somebody's going to come in and take over Ethereum and be Ethereum.
But do you see a world where sort of different, this is one of the questions, like different blockchain technologies kind of coexist for different applications? Or what are your sort of thoughts on what the trend is?
We're moving from the Web2 world to the Web3 world. The Web3 world will have a different identity construct, a self-sovereign identity construct. Uport is our particular version of that. Conforms to the Decentralized Identity Foundation specification. So we're founders, Blockstack, Microsoft, IBM joined later. So I think it's going to be the decentralized identity standard. And these network business models where you have a tokenized business logic and lots of different actors in different roles on these network platforms, I think that's going to be Web3 and transformative. Absolutely, this stuff is going to gain traction or maintain traction and grow pretty quickly.
So what are the, and you can reject the premise of the question if you like, but what do you think is going to be the DApp that brings this to the masses? Like, what's the breakthrough? Where is it likely to come from?
So I don't think it needs to be one application. As I said, we're moving into this phase with the advent of the layer 2 technologies and a bunch of projects, a bunch of game projects. So I think Gods Unchained, Zombie Battleground, silly titles, these things are compelling. Major League Baseball is involved now. Other sports are quite involved. Esports is getting very involved. So gaming is, I think, going to be a huge next wave. Another project that's sort of more mainstream that normal people are really appreciating is a project called Civil. So Civil is a project for sustainable and ethical journalism. So journalism is a mess on the planet right now. Local journalism has been gutted. Journalistic properties have been rolled up. Private equity, hedge funds are sucking the value out of it. And this Project Civil is essentially a platform. It's a foundation, and it's a for-profit company. The foundation's run by Vivian Schiller, who is running PBS in the United States and other major roles. And essentially, you can form a newsroom, you can attach yourselves to the platform, you create a charter for your newsroom, you define who your journalists are, and then you post a security bond to the platform. If you are deemed to be unethical in some way by your readership or your listenership, then they can challenge you and bump you off the platform. So that's the first mechanism. So it's doing a token launch now. Associated Press is now a partner. We're going to announce partnerships with some major journalism properties pretty soon. So I consider that to be the most important thing we've done in a little while. Blockchain systems, decentralized protocols are going to offer us different and maybe better ways of governing ourselves. So liquid democracy, feutarchy, quadratic voting systems. We have a project called GovernX that's exploring that stuff. But we're kind of screwed unless we get good information. So we really need to work on that aspect.
Great. I like this question from Harold, which is, what is your most unpopular blockchain-related opinion?
Unpopular amongst whom?
I'll let you, given that Harold hasn't defined that, I'll let you.
I live in a bubble where things I say are kind of accepted by people in my little bubble. Let me think about that. So I can definitely say things about certain projects that would be unpopular with those projects, but I tend not to do that very much in public.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm an optimist.
So here's a more technical one, which I think we have a very technical audience, which is the EF way. So can you tell us a bit more about recent research news from Vitalik on using zero-knowledge snark in on-chain scaling to, say, 500 transactions a second?
Yeah, so I saw that, and I didn't read the piece on Eth Research. As I understand it, well, I'm not really saying too much here. You bundle up a bunch of transactions, and you probably perform some math on them so that they're all encased in a single function, I'm guessing, and then you can query that function. But I can't give a good answer to that one.
Sure.
There is a lot of Starks and Snarks work going on the platform. So a couple of major projects are essentially building an overlay over Ethereum that will confer privacy and confidentiality, but also scalability.
So this is from Crypto Cactus. Gosh, these names are getting interesting. Which the narrow version is, do you own a crypto kitty? But maybe more broadly, you could talk about your views on NFTs and sort of.
Sure. So friendly with the Axiom Zen people, and they sent me 2 really cool shiny metallic shirts and 2 for my girlfriend, and she owns a few crypto kitties as well. So that is the extent of my engagement, but I think it's a pretty great project. Non-fungible tokens, they're going to be huge. They're going to be the basis of many different games, many different art platforms, real estate potentially. We have a platform called Meridio that's doing that. Harbor is doing some really cool things. So I guess they're going to be as big as fungible tokens, if not bigger, probably.
So Nick asks, do you think companies will actually ever be allowed to rely on smart contracts without using the conventional legal system as a backstop? And if so, or if not, what are the use cases you see for them?
So you could certainly rely on a pure smart contract or a program on the blockchain that guarantees execution. You probably don't want to do that if you want recourse to the legal system. But there's this notion of a Ricardian contract that has off-chain paperwork or off-chain documentation and on-chain documentation, and they reference each other, and you can enable that agreement on the blockchain to be legally enforceable. Again, our open law project enables blockchain-based legally enforceable agreements. So you can basically ingest a whole document. You can use the markup language, turn words into variables, things that your variables are over here, and you can fill out names and numbers, etc., and it populates the entire document. And one of your clauses or several of your clauses can be programmatic, and you can have state changes. So a bunch of people could sign this part of an agreement and transition to the next part of the agreement, and you're cryptographically signing, and you can escrow money into the agreement. If you want that agreement to be transparent, you can publish it in its entirety on the blockchain. If you want it to be private, then you create a digital digest of it, you sign it, and you timestamp it on the blockchain, and you can produce that at any point in the future. So the infrastructure is there already. We're starting to use it at ConsenSys. Rocket Lawyer is, I think they have 35 million customers. They are onboarding blockchain-based identity, and they're building with us, with the open law group. They're starting to use that technology. We'll build an arbitration system. So it's coming fast. The type in open law in YouTube. There's some really great demos.
Someone has a follow-up question on the traditional management nullification tool, which is how easily could other companies adopt it? Like, what stage is it at? What would be supposing someone wanted to do this tomorrow, what would they do?
We are slamming that team so heavily with requests. Give us a few minutes before we put it out into the world.
What are your thoughts in general? This is from Mo on private blockchains, private versus public, tokenization versus non-tokenization models. Like, how do you think about that?
So yeah, you can have a distributed ledger that doesn't have tokens. Nothing wrong with that. And we see a world of hundreds or thousands of decentralized protocols. So that's kind of what Web 3.0 will be. It'll be trusted transactions, automated agreements, smart software objects on platforms like Ethereum, decentralized storage. They already exist. We use them all the time. Decentralized bandwidth, there are a few early attempts at that. Decentralized heavy compute, 3 of those are live on Ethereum right now: Golem, Sonum, iExec. Decentralized proof of location in the form of foam. So all these things are going to work together to enable more sophisticated applications. Lots of these building blocks are getting built. Price stable tokens, we've got a whole bunch of those coming to market right now, in addition to the Maker DAI, which is already doing really well. Lots of the standards for fungible tokens, for non-fungible tokens, atomic swap protocols, parameterized insurance products. So all those things are kind of tokenized. In many cases, they're going to be tradable. We've got a platform for an adjacent music industry, and the songs aren't tokens yet, but they're about to be tokens. And so I guess with respect to private networks, I think it's we're sort of in the intranet phase of the blockchain space, where in these first few years, where we don't have really good privacy and confidentiality and scalability, we need to build systems that are essentially private and permissioned. And it's sort of a societal transformation thing where governments have to get comfortable that it's protected because it's behind a firewall. Not really. But we'll see this year a bunch of private permission systems linked into public Ethereum. And over time, as public blockchain gets more scalable, we're going to build our private permission systems on top of public blockchain, just like companies are now comfortable being on the internet and on
I hear
cloud.
that.
Yeah, exactly. So we have a project called Kaleido that's enabling that right now. So it's a team that built version 1 to 3 of blockchain as a service for IBM's Fabric within IBM. And they have built this blockchain as a service platform in partnership with AWS, and there's 1,000 consortia on the free tier right now, and some of them are starting to pay for it. You can spin up your private consortium blockchain system or your corporate blockchain system. You type in a bunch of email addresses, they get a message, and basically an instance can be set up, and a blockchain node is set up and connected right into an existing Ethereum consortium network. Different geos, different consensus algorithms, and it has this collusion resistance mechanism where it can hash up the state of the blockchain and pin that to public Ethereum.
Oh, cool.
So we'll see more relay mechanisms like that emerging.
Excellent. Just a reminder, if you want to ask a question, we're still taking questions on Slido, so sli.do. We're not going to take questions from the floor. Pardon?
It doesn't fit, it's too many characters, it won't let me post it.
Too many characters.
Can we give her the
All
mic?
right, let's give her the mic.
Okay. Sorry, I just wanted to ask, how do you feel about...
A very long question.
Yeah, I was going to say, it worries me that that's the filter.
Sorry, how do you feel about the fact that although cryptocurrency is meant to decentralize the control of currency and give more power to the individual, essentially because there's now a few select groups and people that control and own most of, for example, bitcoins, and once they're in circulation, it's essentially become re-centralized and defeated the original purpose for which it was created?
Yeah, so it's hard to get to full radical decentralization right away. It started maybe very centralized as an idea, and then it gets more decentralized, and there's a bunch of value there, so a bunch of smart people come in and try to capture that value, and hopefully, and I know this is the case on the Ethereum project, you have people who are very dedicated to making it as decentralized and trustworthy as possible. So we just need to keep building the system in that direction. It's still a very unsophisticated system. We intended to do proof of stake early on, but there were edge cases that we knew about that we couldn't solve. We knew we could make proof of work properly. We tried to create an ASIC resistant or centralization resistant proof of work. Did incredibly well for a while, and now that's sort of falling by the wayside. But proof of stake is pretty much solved at this point. And when we implement it, it will not burn lots of electricity. It won't require specialized hardware, won't waste a lot of computation. You'll be able to post a small security bond in a smart contract on Ethereum, and you'll be able to run it from a phone or a laptop, so the barrier to entry will get very low. Efficiencies of scale won't be available for proof of stake, and so we think that's going to be a much more decentralized way of running these systems.
So I have a question from Yanis, which is about regulations. How do you think about working with regulators and kind of keeping them or making them supportive of kind of the work that you're doing and others are doing?
Yeah, so we do a lot of that all around the world, and from early on, we were pleasantly surprised that regulators were people, really nice people who kind of wanted the same things that us crypto nerds wanted. They wanted better, fairer systems, more equitable distribution of wealth, even in many cases, and protection of consumers, reduction of fraud, stuff like that. And so it's gone really well. We've, in many cases, we've had an educational role. And I'm more familiar with what's going on in the United States, but in Bermuda and Malta and Gibraltar and Singapore and lots of places where we're pretty present, in Wyoming in the US. Lots of them are really getting it, and they're seeing opportunities. So they're big entrenched nation state actors that might want things to continue as they are for a while, but these other smaller actors are really seeing the value, and they're trying to create contexts that are very friendly. In the United States, I think the SEC has a great perspective on things. So we have had deep discussions with lots of regulators in the US, and the SEC understands that there is this thing called a consumer utility token, and if you construct it properly and market it properly, then it's not a security in their estimation.
This is probably a niche question, but what's the significance of Wyoming? That's not a name I thought you would say, but
we go where we're asked.
okay.
So we used to be really excited when people asked us to go somewhere, and we still are, but we're busier now. But so backstory is Caitlin Long, who's prominent in the financial industry in New York, and was at Morgan Stanley for a long time as an analyst. She was brought in there, and I think she grew up in Wyoming, and they put together a bunch of legislation, 5 different bills, and we were called in pretty late, and we have a fair amount of experience with that stuff, and so there are pitfalls when you're writing the rules, and so we helped out a little bit at the end.
Great. So 2 consensus-related questions. One, which is anonymous, which is how is consensus funded? And one from Yako, which was, what are your tips for people who would want to seek a career at consensus?
I think there's a website.
Sounds well, the future is here.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you can apply on the website. I think right on the front page. We're changing the website, but there's probably still a way of accessing jobs from the front page. ConsenSys is funded internally. It is owned internally. All of the shares of ConsenSys are owned by ConsenSys people. And we also have a bunch of business lines that make some small amounts of money and some make big amounts of money. So the consulting arm, multi-tens of billions of dollars. We do token launches. Have you heard of token launches? Some of them have done well over the year or years. And so we have a bunch of our own projects that we've token launched, and we token launch third-party projects. And we do security audit work, so that's a very lucrative line of business. We can't hire fast enough for that. We turn away 90-something% of the projects that want us to do that work. We have an accounting system that is serving a bunch of different projects. Academy is doing a lot of education around the world, getting paid for it.
Sounds like a good way to fund things. Make money, very controversial in VC, of course, but can you talk a little bit about, I think, obviously we're in a sort of bear market at the moment, at least from a sort of liquid token price perspective. What do you think about, is that having any impact on sort of talent flowing into the sector? Is it having any impact in other ways, or do you see it as kind of a healthy period of pause, as it were?
So it's probably having an impact on talent flowing into the sector, because the converse had a massive impact on talent flowing into the ecosystem. We've seen 5 or 6 massive, irrationally exuberant booms, and each one was followed by a correction. Each one brought much more attention and entrepreneurs and technologists, and the DAO debacle brought a whole lot of cybersecurity engineers into our space, and right now we're seeing exponential growth in our ecosystem, and maybe 20 or 50 times more activity than we saw a year ago. So, and that's a result of essentially all this attention from the most recent boom. So one has to assume that all those people are going to build more interesting foundational infrastructure, and probably just things move so fast, much faster than 1999, where we could muster one boom and then one correction and then sort of, not really a boom again, but profound societal transformation. And I just think that we're going to see a bunch of these booms. Because the technology is so available, the education's available, low barrier to entry. B, because it's natively digital money, and that just drives people crazy, it seems.
A semi-related question from Tim. He says, you talk about patience, but obviously startups often can't afford to be patient. Do you think
Who can't afford to be?
Startups often can't afford to be, or rather they can run out of money while being patient? Do you feel that the ecosystems that you work in are ready for entrepreneurs to start building companies with sustainable business models, or is it still very reliant?
Yeah, of course. So we were in an odd situation. We're a very strangely shaped company because we were formed before there was an ecosystem, before we had a platform, a release platform, before developer tools. So we had to build it on our own. And we started building some projects. We were thinking they might be sustainable, but we weren't sure. We were doing just a lot of experiments back then. And then we started getting calls by companies and governments, educate us, build a POC with us. And so eventually we needed to hire lots of people and educate lots of people. So we formed ConsenSys Academy, and then the boom hit, and we realized that we shouldn't just be spending our money in-house. We need to pay attention to what's going on in the broader ecosystem. So ventures started, and the token launch, Token Foundry was an obvious thing for us to do. So back then it was about opening up an ecosystem. Now it's about existing within a real ecosystem and making different decisions. So we have a process called the Resource Allocation Circle. It's barriers to continuing your project at ConsenSys are getting higher. The barriers to bringing projects into ConsenSys are getting much higher, and so we now have to compete.
So I think we've got time for two more, so I'll ask one and give you a chance while I'm asking it to, if you have any last questions to ask. So you mentioned a little bit about self-governance earlier, and this is sort of a follow-up question on that kind of, how do you think this will be achieved in practice? Like, what are your thoughts more generally on self-governance as playing a role in everything you're talking about?
Governance of platforms. What do you mean?
Jack, do you want to elaborate on your question?
Like me governing myself?
Jack? No one wants to admit to asking that question?
It's a pseudonym. So what, I mean, I can answer the question with an assumption.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, make an assumption.
Yeah, so the assumption is how do these platforms effectively govern themselves?
Right.
So essentially, I think we should do lots of experiments. I think we should build a mechanism that enables broader participation, even if it's only voice and not necessarily decision-making power. At the start of the Ethereum project, we sort of pledged to move as quickly as possible to radically decentralized governance and build the tools to enable that. And I think we have very good governance on the Ethereum platform, but I don't think we're going to move to automated governance as with Decred or Tezos or something like that. It's and I was kind of in favor of doing that, trying to figure that out. Vlad and Vitalik had a discussion with them about exactly this 7 days ago or something like that, and they're very happy with how governance is going. I'm very happy with how governance is going. If you really understand what's going on the Ethereum project, you know that there are many different classes of actors. They all have voice. When there's an issue, everybody talks about it. We get signals from different factions or different kinds of actors, whether they're exchanges or pools or foundation paid developers or the foundation itself or exchanges or companies in the space. So it's really become a very decentralized ecosystem. Vitalik is extremely good at not expressing his opinion in a contentious issue. So he prefers to let people speak, and we all source information much more broadly that way. And decisions are made by a lot of people. So taking the DAO, very complicated discussion. What ended up happening was, even though many of us were against hard fork to fix an application layer problem. It was a very sensitive time. It was a baby blockchain, and this adversary could have kept denial of service accounts going for a long time. So it was deemed an existential threat. Yet what we ended up releasing was, even though the developers didn't want to do the fork, they enabled people to download code and you could choose which side of the fork you wanted to be on. So everybody was really able to make their choice. And what ended up happening was, it looked like maybe 10% of the people wanted strong immutability and the classic side of things. And that's roughly what we ended up, before the release of the code, and that's roughly what we ended up seeing.
Interesting. Okay, so final one. Do you see a future where all traditional securities are tokenized? And if so, when will that happen?
Yeah,
Can you talk a bit about what will happen, when that might happen?
I don't know when it will happen. So, equities markets are quite efficient right now. Many other markets are less efficient, real estate, syndicated lending,
Right.
etc. So we're already seeing bonds on the Ethereum blockchain, Daimler-Benz, World Bank, some banks are going to be doing that pretty soon. So the mechanism will be much more fluid. The likelihood of double creation of different instruments goes to pretty close to zero. You won't have, as in the Dole Food Company, you won't have 100% or 140% of the shares voted. That will be impossible. You won't have naked short selling. But more importantly, in private equity and other kinds of situations in real estate, you'll have liquidity. You'll have the instant ability to get out of a position without illiquidity discounts and carve off a little bit of a position so that you can, instead of getting a loan, you can sell a piece of your property and improve it or something like that. So it's just a better technology. I mean, it used to be that equities were on pieces of paper, and in the 70s, in New York at least, they had to close the stock market a couple days a week and have half days because the messengers just couldn't deal with the load, and moved to different mechanisms, which ultimately led to the DTCC in the United States owning all the stock. Or it's actually it's like Sid and Company that's owned by the DTCC, which is owned by a bunch of financial institutions. So if you think you own stock, you really have a contract with your sub-broker, which has a contract with your broker, which has a contract with the central depository, and so none of us own any equity.
On that optimistic note.
Yeah, exactly. And so we'll be able to directly own equity. That'd be cool.
I feel I should ask this last one because it's been outvoted so many times, and I think I know what you're going to say, but did you invent Bitcoin?
No.
Joe, thank you so much for being with us. It's been
Thanks,
great.
everyone.